Acts chapter 22, verses 1 through 11. Once again, Acts chapter 22, verses 1 through 11. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. And so Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Now at about noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light but did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. So for the sake of context, we are reminded that once again Paul has ended his second mission trip and has returned back to Jerusalem, where we read about it in chapter 21. Paul is welcomed back by the church, and as he's giving a report of all that the Holy Spirit had been doing amongst the Gentiles, the first church in Jerusalem gladly received this report. However, they have to give some sobering news to Paul, and they warn him that rumors about him had spread throughout Jerusalem. Now, this rumor that had spread about him was that Paul had been teaching the Gentiles to go away, to turn away, to reject the laws of Moses. And so the apostles, wanting to refute this tangibly, began to gather ways to show the Jewish community that Paul was still respectful and honoring and obeying the law of Moses. And to not create confusion, they also decided to send a letter to the Gentiles reiterating their position on what to do and what not to do when it comes to food and sexual immorality. Paul goes to the temple where there he's captured because they are able to lock the gates, and they gather around him and they beat him, assaulting him with the intent to kill him. Paul escapes and finds some Roman soldiers, but the commander of that group, of the troop, arrests Paul, and while trying to decipher what exactly has been going on, he's confused because there's so many people simultaneously screaming and yelling their positions and opinions. And so Paul asks for permission to address the crowd, and this is where we read in chapter 22 Paul's testimony towards the crowd. Now, the word testimony we oftentimes talk about in the church, but I think a lot of us don't actually know what that term means. The word testimony is actually a legal term, and the testimony that you usually have will come from a witness. And there's two kinds of witnesses that you will call to give a testimony. One is an expert witness. An expert witness is somebody who has a particular expertise in that area. And so they'll share from that position of expertise their opinions and their views about the specific matter. So for those of us who are old enough, right, or you guys like actually good movies, one of my favorite law movies was a movie called My Cousin Vinny, right? Am I the only one old enough to know that? All right, thank you. Right, and one of my favorite scenes is when he calls his girlfriend, Marissa Tomei, right, to be a witness. And why does he call her as a witness? Because it turns out that she was what? An expert when it came to automobile vehicles, right? And he says that why have you called this person? I have called her for her general knowledge of automobiles. She is an expert witness. She's able to bring value to what's going to be decided because of her expertise. Now, the other witnesses in that movie that were called were what we call what? Eyewitnesses. And they're giving a testimony from their first point of view, first person point of view. It can't be something that they heard about from somebody else or what somebody else saw, but they are saying, this is what I specifically saw, heard, smelled, witnessed. And they're giving account of that. And similarly, when we are called to give a testimony, you will come at it from one of two positions, either of that of an expert witness or that of an eyewitness. But I think the reason why I clarify this is because for many of us, when we're asked to give a testimony, our presumption or the pressure that we feel or put on ourselves is that we all think we're called to be an expert witness. And so the burden we say is, but Pastor, I really have not read the Bible that many times. I don't really know theology. I'm not that familiar with doctrines. If people ask me questions, I won't know what to say. And the reality to that is this. Many of you guys were not called to be an expert witness. Right? And God is not asking you to share a testimony from that position. Now, there are those who have been called as a pastor, as theologians. They are called to share from a position of being an expert witness. Most of us are being called to share a testimony from the position of being an eyewitness. Right? Sharing what you yourself have seen and heard, have felt, and experienced from your encounter of the living Lord Jesus Christ. And from that, every one of us can share a testimony if you are a believer. Because for all of us, Christ is living and has done something relevant and powerful in our lives. Now, very quickly, with a short amount of time, I want to just go over Paul's testimony here. We didn't read the whole testimony. I actually encourage you to read the whole testimony, but only a portion of it is what we read. But the breakdown of Paul's testimony is this. He shares a little bit about who he was, or the truth of who he was. Then he then shares a little bit about his experience of meeting Christ and how that led to this transformation of this new person, this new life, this new purpose of who he became. So who he was, the encounter with Christ, and then the new person that he now became. And the structure of this testimony is very, very relevant because they're all connected to one another. Now, this testimony, sharing the testimony starts off with this fundamental question. Paul, why did you change? We all know, right? They're all saying that as people who grew up in Jerusalem, everybody was familiar with who Paul was. Everybody was familiar with him. And they're like, Paul, this person that you are now is not who we knew. It feels like you betrayed us. It feels like you betrayed your Jewish customs. It feels like you betrayed your Jewish religion. Who are you? How did you come to change? And this leads to the story of Paul sharing. He says, look, you're right. You all know who I was. I was born in Tarsus, meaning that I was a Roman citizen. Right? Giving me incredible power, incredible privilege. But even in the midst of that, while having that kind of privilege and power, I was raised in Jerusalem. I was educated here. I was familiar with all the Jewish customs and all the Jewish laws. In fact, the person who discipled me, the person who taught me, of all people was Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the top scholar of that time. So the top scholar, the top biblical Jewish scholar, is the person who taught me, mentored me. I was his top disciple. And this is proven by the fact that of all the zealous young people that were here, the person that was chosen to carry out the plan of persecuting the believers, persecuting the Christians, was me. They entrusted that work to me. So yeah, you're right. This is who I was. You all are familiar with the story of who I was. But let me tell you now what changed. Right? This change that you're also curious about, you're so frustrated and angry about, let me tell you what happened. And he begins to go into great detail about his meeting of Christ, as we had read. He tells them the time, hey, at around noon, while I was near Damascus, suddenly from heaven there was a bright light that flashed upon me. And I fell to the ground. And as I fell to the ground, I heard this voice crying out to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And there's this dialogue that he talks about between Paul and Jesus. And after that dialogue had finished, he says, look, I tried to open my eyes, but I couldn't because I was blind. And I can testify that all of this is true because I was not the only person there. There were other people that were sent with me, these colleagues of mine. And they'll tell you, they also saw this bright light and were scared by it. They didn't understand what the voice was saying. But they knew that something within me had been affected because they realized I was blind, and so they had to lead me by the hand to Damascus. And we didn't read about it, but then he continues on by talking about his encounter with a man named Ananias. He tells him, you all know Ananias. He's very well known in Damascus. He is an observer of the law, very devout. He is very much respected by all the Jewish leaders and by the Jewish community there. Everybody knows him and can testify he is a truly good man. Ananias came to me because God sent him to me. And he prayed for me, and then I received sight. And Ananias would convey to me the message of God about my particular calling of what God had wanted for my life. And he begins to share about these things in great detail. Now, why do I go over these things? Because some of you guys might hear this and will feel pressure that, oh wow, Pastor Elijah, like I have to have a good memory, I have to be organized, I have to be doing all these different things. Let me tell you a couple of things that's very interesting about how Paul shares his testimony. Number one is this. Paul deliberately chooses not to speak in any foreign language, but what does he do? After talking with the Roman soldier in the Roman language, when he addresses the crowd, it says in verse 2 that he began to speak in Aramaic, in the Hebrew language, in the local language, the local vernacular of the people, so that they can understand. Secondly is when you look at the structure of his testimony, it's in a very simple storytelling form. It's not theological, it's not scriptural, it's not any of those things, but it's a very simple story form that he decides to go by. Right? Now, the question of all these details, right? I'm going, Pastor Elijah, I am not good with memorizing things. I can't memorize my cell phone number. I don't even memorize my bank account number, right? This feels like it's too much for me. Let me share with you something very important. This is the part where it's really relevant to Paul's testimony. Paul's ability to memorize and to remember that moment when he met Jesus in that kind of great detail is not because he's so intellectual. It's not because he's so smart. It's not because he has like photogenic memory. It is because in his life, for his recollection, this was one of those historically monumental, eventful moments. And let me explain to you why this is important to understand that context. What's interesting, and we see this happening throughout history, is this. There are certain key moments in history that when you ask that generation, they remember it in great vivid detail. So for example, if you ask those of us who are older, like your parents, right, about what it was like when they found out that Kennedy had been assassinated, people will remember it in great detail. I was just with my boss's mother, she's 92 years old, right, losing her memory all over the place. Her memory's fading, right? But we, for some random reason, spoke about Kennedy, President Kennedy. And she would say, like, oh my gosh, I remember when I saw the news, when I heard that he had been shot. She could tell you what reporter was on the news. She could tell you what channel she was watching. She could tell you the time, right? She could tell you the vivid voice of that person. She'll tell you about what it was like to just go on her knees, and she'll recite for you the exact prayer that she said. Right? She remembers that moment in such a vivid, great detail. This is true that some of you guys are youth students, so you guys, this won't apply to, but those of us who are older, right? This is true for our generation. You know why? Because for our generation, you know what that moment was? 9/11. Right? Like, I'm old enough to remember what it was like when I turned on the TV and I saw, why is the Twin Towers on fire? And then the moment that you realize this was not an accident, but this was a terrorist attack. And I remember that moment when you saw that building collapsing and people freaking out, and you saw this cloud of dust on the TV. I remember hearing all the sirens, right, passing by my house as everyone was rushing towards Manhattan. I remember these things. I remember freaking out as my dad, it was Tuesday morning, my dad had a Presbyterian meeting, and he had to go to Brooklyn, and he had to pass through that area to get to where he needs to go. And I remember freaking out, going, oh my God, is my dad okay? Is my dad alive? Did the building collapse while he was there downtown Manhattan? I remember that moment. I remember friends of mine who had just started at NYU at Parsons and thinking to themselves, they just moved into their dorms. Are they alive? Are they okay? And trying to call, but all the numbers were down because everyone was freaking out and trying to call each other. I remember all those moments in great detail. And it's not because I'm so smart. It's not because I'm so intellectual. But that moment was so historical that it gets etched into your memory, etched into your brain. And for those of us who are older, I'm sure many of you guys can relate to what I'm saying. Like, you remember that day so vividly. You remember how you felt. You remember what you saw. See, this is the phenomenon that Paul experiences. You experience that memory. Why? Because something intuitively in your brain, in your body, in your heart, right, understands that this is a moment that's changing everything. Like when you realize what's happening at 9/11, what was happening as that building was on fire, and as that building was crushed, you knew that everything in history, everything in life was about to change. I was old enough to know that. And it's true, like those of you guys who are young, you don't realize it, but once upon a time, you could bring water from the outside to your airplane. Right? This is the post 9/11 thing, right? Then like carrying your bags, that didn't happen a long time ago. Those of you who are like around my age or even older, right? There was a time in which, I know you guys are going to be shocked by this, but there was a time in which you could smoke on an airplane. Right? All these things changed after 9/11. Like 9/11 changed everything about travel. And here, for Paul, the reason why he's able to remember with such great detail is not because of his intellect, but the moment that the light flashed upon him, something intuitively within him knew, wow, everything about my life is about to change. My life is never going to be the same after this moment. And because of that, he's able to remember things with such great described detail. And this is the important part. The evidence of the validity of his testimony was not in the ability to remember. The evidence of the validity of his testimony was not in the words that he has spoken, but ultimately what? It is about the transformed life that he began to live after that moment. What made his testimony of saying, wow, the reason why I can remember this moment so vividly is because this is one of those historically monumental moments in which my life is going to be transformed, in which my life is going to be utterly changed. It's not going to be the same. And if people can look at that and say, wow, there's something credible to what you're about to say, Paul. Why? It's because when we look at your life and who you were and who you are now, you're right. You are not the same. You are completely different. You are completely transformed. And that is the power of Paul's testimony. What we misunderstand about chapter 22 is we think that the power of Paul's testimony is in his intellect or in his words, but it's actually in the life transformed in which he lived. Because it does two things. Number one, it makes people curious. Paul, we knew who you were. Everything you said about yourself, we know who you were. And you're right. We love that person. Who is this new person? We don't understand. We want to figure out what changed about you. And therefore, that question of what changed about you, what's different about you, led to the question and opportunity to share about his encounter with Christ. And what led to the credibility to actually believe and find his experience encountering Christ to be believable is that he lived a transformed life. And brothers and sisters, this is what I want to challenge you with. The power of the gospel and the power of sharing and proclaiming the gospel is not found in our intellect. It's not found in how articulate you are. But people find the gospel to be credible, to be believable, and intriguing and curious when they look at your life and they say, wow, we knew who you were, but who you are now is so radically, radically different. What changed? And when you share about that moment in which you too met Christ, experienced Christ, received Christ, that testimony becomes credible and believable. This is where I want to close. All right? What does it mean for us then to begin to go out and live a life, of new purpose, like Paul, so that our testimonies are credible? I think for a lot of us, we feel this burden or pressure to become different. Right? Like, for example, some people feel the pressure that, I guess, if I was living a corporate life, right, I was having a corporate job, I should give up working in the banking industry or do whatever, and I should become a missionary, right? And I would say, no, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Okay? Why do I say that? Because look at Paul's life. Look at what Paul is describing here. Paul is describing himself in the past, not in the sake of, I was this terribly wicked person. Right? He could have done that. He does that in other passages where he says, I was a murderer, I was the worst of all sinners. But he doesn't actually describe himself in that kind of way. And his transformation is not, I was bad and then I became a good person. His description of who he was this, is that man, of all people, if anyone should have felt confident that they were a good, moral, righteous person, it's me. Right? Because look, I was born as a Roman citizen. You cannot be any better than that in societal status. In Jewish culture, I was raised and educated in Jerusalem. And of all the people, I was studying under the best. And I excelled. And of all those that were studying under the best, guess what? I was the top of the class. Why? Because I was the one chosen to carry out all their most important, exclusive missions and their work. So if anyone had the right to stand before confidence and say, man, I'm good. I'm a good person. I'm living a good life. It's me. Until what? Until I met Jesus. Until I saw Jesus. Then everything about that narrative suddenly became changed. And I realized how wicked I was, how corrupt I was. So that understanding of Paul's testimony really hit me hard, personally. Because I thought to myself, wow, I think I have that same kind of arrogant attitude. I'm a good pastor. I work hard. I pray for my members. I prepare my sermons. Right? And then, as I began to reflect on Paul's testimony, and I looked upon Christ, the perfect shepherd, the perfect pastor, there was something very humbling about that. I realized, man, I'm not that good a pastor, actually. I need more of him. I need his grace. I need his power. I need his anointing. I need Christ. I need Christ to deal with my simple attitudes to the church. I need Christ to deal with my simple laziness, my procrastinating habits. I need Christ to deal with all these things. All these secret things, all these subtle little things that I just thought were no big deals, and I'm good, I'm better than most pastors. Right? I made me arrogant, and standing for the glory and the holiness of Christ, I began to realize how wicked and wretched I was, and how much, like Paul says, how much I needed his grace, how much I needed his forgiveness. Right? And that's what changed Paul, and that was what began to change my understanding of what it means to be a pastor. It transformed me. And a lot of people tell you this, right? As a brother, as a pastor, things like that, a lot of people especially ask my sister, because she's the one who's probably experienced and witnessed me in all these different facets. What was your brother like? And I heard that our brother Tim shared a testimony about his life in his class, right? And if you guys thought he was a bad person once upon a time, I'm never going to show you my stories. I was a terrible person once upon a time, right? But this is the thing that my sister will tell you, that a lot of people who knew me for 20 plus years will tell you, is that what they'll tell you about me is that I am not the same person. It's not that I learned to become a more disciplined person. It's not that I learned to become a better person. It's that I'm not the same person that I used to be. That's why for me, I'm not ashamed of my past. I'm not ashamed of who I was, because that's not who I am any longer. And that's what Paul is sharing here. Is all this time I thought I was good, and I realized I'm not. And I challenge many of you here to think about that for your own lives. How many of us here have this presumptive attitude of thinking, I'm a good worker, I'm a good deacon, I'm a good church member, I'm a good daughter, I'm a good father, I'm a good mother. And maybe in many ways, in worldly standards, you are. But maybe that's also the reason why you're not. It's keeping your eyes off of Christ. It's keeping your eyes off of him. And doing the full glory, the full work that he wants and intended for you. The second thing as to why that's important to really think about Paul's testimony in that kind of way is this. Because then it helps you to better live out your purpose in the context of your life. Because look at Paul. In many ways, right, the thinking that we have is, oh, that I got to change my life, I got to change how I eat, I got to change all this. No. And actually, in many ways, Paul's life, in certain ways, did not change at all. Paul was traveling before, and he's traveling after. Paul was a teacher of the word, and he's a teacher of the word after. Right? Paul was religious and zealous. He was religious and zealous thereafter. It's interesting that in many ways, What Paul did in his life did not change whatsoever, and yet it is testified about him, and he testifies about himself, that he is not the same person. He's doing the same work, but he's not the same person. And that's a challenge I have for many of us here. What does it mean for us to experience and encounter Christ on Sundays in our worship services and our personal devotions in such a way that, yes, you go back home and you do the same work of cleaning, of laundry, of cooking, whatever else, paying the bills, paying the mortgage or the rent. You have to work and do your work. You have to deal with people. All those things are not going to change after a sermon or after encountering Christ. But what does it mean for us to do that same exact work that God has trusted us with, placed in our lives, but as a completely new person? As a completely new person with a new heart, new mindset, a new attitude, new perspective. What does it mean for us to go back home and not just to have children, but to really be a mother, to really be a father? Right? What does it mean for us to go back to work and not just to do work and earn a paycheck, but to truly work in a glorifying, honoring way? What does it mean for us to come back next Sunday? Right? Not just to attend church and sing songs, but to be true worshipers of God. Like, what does these mean? What does it mean for us in the context of what God has placed into our lives, in the normality of our lives, and yet still testify of the transformational power of Christ, because we do these things in such a powerfully, radically new way, because we are a radically new person. See, this is the part that Paul is testifying about. It wasn't the idea of I was a drug dealer and now I don't deal drugs and I passed out Bibles. Paul's testimony is not that at all. Paul's testimony is, all this time I have been doing these things and I thought I was good, but I realized what a wretched sinner I was. And man, God cleansed me, forgave me, and transformed me. And now I still do those zealous religious work, but as a new person, I pray, brothers and sisters, that that's what can be testified about you. Your children, those of us who are married and have children, that your children can look at this as, man, mom, dad, you're doing all the same things. You're cooking, cleaning, and helping me get ready for school, but man, there's something radically different about you. Something different. They can feel it.